Good evening, students. This evening we will be talking about Europe plunging into war. Our essential question is, how did the alliance system lead to war, and how did industrialization make the war so violent? Again, please take focused notes and record the alliance system. Pay specific attention to the bold words and highlight important battles. For the end, summarize your notes answering the essential question. Thank you. We will start with talking about the Triple Entente, which was the Ally, or also known as the Allied Powers, or Allies. This included Great Britain, France, and Russia. The second alliance that we'll talk about is the Triple Alliance, which was Austria, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Although there were four in this one, we will see why eventually it will become the Triple Alliance. So how did the war start? Essentially, by August 1914, battle lines were drawn between all sides, and the initial declaration of war were being made in the following orders. So first, Austria declares war on Serbia for not handing over the Black Hand. Secondly, Serbia's allies, Russia, mobilizes forces towards war by moving its forces towards the border with Austria. Germany sees this as a declaration of war and declares war on Russia for its mobilization against its ally. Germany then attacks Belgium and France, and England declares war on Germany in response to these attacks, and thus the world is firmly entrenched in an extremely bloody affair. Now, from here on out, we'll use two terms to define the sides: the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. Austria-Hungary and Germany would become known as the Central Powers because of the fact that they were in the center of Europe. Now, the Allies would eventually add Japan as one of their countries, Japan wanting to get in on European power and prestige, and they would also add Italy. Italy would leave the Central Powers specifically because they were upset with Germany and they're attacking Belgium and France and basically starting the war. They saw Germany as being unjust, and therefore they would leave the Central Powers and join the Allies. On the eve of warfare, many people thought that this would be a quick and relatively bloodless war. However, Sir Edward Grey, a foreign minister of England, saw something different. He quoted, "Lights have gone out all over Europe and would not be relit in our lifetime." Essentially, he was predicting what would be a bloody and devastating war. Because of new technology, many people felt like this war would be a fast-moving and relatively painless war. But what we got instead was a bloody stalemate. This particularly reared its head in northern France, which would eventually become known as the Western Front. What caused this stalemate was something called the Schieffelin Plan, which was actually developed by the Germans in order to end the war as fast as possible. It was developed by a guy named Alfred Graf von Schieffelin. It was meant to prevent a fight on two fronts. What would happen is that Germany would attack France through Belgium as fast as and defeat them as fast as possible, and then they would go ahead and transfer their forces to the Eastern Front in order to fight Russia, which would eventually just be mobilizing as their fight with France would end. There was no room for error, and they needed everything to go seamlessly. But as luck would have it, that is not what would happen, and Germany would eventually be trapped on both sides. Having whooped them about 30 years before, the Germans thought that a victory in France would be easy, and initially it did seem this way. Germany actually pushed within a few miles of Paris, but eventually the Allies would regroup, and on September 5th, they would stop the German advance at the Marne River. This would be known as the First Battle of the Marne. Now, while Germany was tied up with France on the Western Front, Russia was invading Germany, and it was forcing Germany to send thousands of troops to the east to help fight them off. Unfortunately for the Germans, they did not choose wisely in their allies, and Austria had an old and ill-equipped army that even Russia was able to deal with. So Germany now was sandwiched between two powers, France in the west and Russia in the east, fighting essentially two different wars. The stalemate that would ensue would be marked by something called trench warfare. A trench is essentially a fortified position that is dug into the ground. In order to take your enemy's line, you had to remove them from their trench, which caused significant human losses for a small land to gain. And also this was, really damaged by the invention of the machine gun, which is probably one of the most deadly weapons ever invented in human history. It made trench warfare extremely deadly because anybody attempting to leave their trench would have to deal with a machine gun nest. You wanted to get away from the machine gun, and you wanted to protect yourself from a machine gun, and you had machine guns protecting you from others. All right, so what we see here is a diagram of a trench. Essentially, a trench is where people lived, they ate, they slept. Everything was done in the trench. Towards the back is where you had the living portions of the trench, where you got your food, you got your ammunition, etc. Towards the front was the fighting portion of the trench, which is where soldiers would prepare themselves to go over the top into no man's land, which would be the position between your trench and your enemy's trench, sometimes as little as 50 yards, sometimes a couple of miles. But in order to get to your enemy's line, you would have to expose yourself by climbing over the top of your trench, sometimes wearing upwards of 50 to 60 pounds of gear, and again, exposing yourself to that withering machine gun fire. Now, besides the general risk of death, living in the trenches was simply barbaric and terrible. Men slept in foul, mud-drenched continuously. They had to deal with rats on basically on an everyday occasion, and because of this, disease was absolutely rampant. There was typhoid, there was typhus, there was the flu, obviously, and the worst of all is the picture to the top right, and this is called trench foot. This is what happens when your feet are constantly exposed to cold, damp conditions. Oftentimes, soldiers would stand in mud up to their knees for days on end without being able to dry their feet or to change their footwear in any way. What would happen is your feet would essentially decay while they were on your body. This would often lead to amputations and just extreme pain caused by trench foot. Battles in the trench were a very slow, arduous affair. Generally speaking, it called for people to go over the top, which meant to say that they had to go into no man's land, which was a space between the opposing trenches. You had to capture this territory and then eventually capture your enemy's trench in order to be victorious. This meant exposing yourself to blistering machine gun fire from machine gun nests as the one pictured on the top right. Also, other weapons that were in use were poison gas, hand grenades, anti-aircraft fire, and much else. Battles in the First World War were not measured in miles, but they were measured in yards gained. Oftentimes, a yard of land would cost hundreds of deaths. The trench warfare, which marked the Western Front, essentially saw trenches dug in all the way from the North Sea on the Belgian coast all the way to the Swiss border, with barely an inch of French or German territory not marked by trenches. World War I battles were beyond bloody, with basically the peak of it coming in 1916 at the Battle of Verdun, where 300,000 men were lost in a single battle. It was not unheard of for upwards of 50,000 men being lost in a single day during battle during the First World War. This is highlighted by the Battle of Somme in the Verdun Valley. On the first day of fighting, in this particular fight, the British would lose 20,000 men killed in action. That means they actually died on that first 12 hours of fighting, with another 37,000 men wounded or missing on the same day. By the time the Battle of Somme ended in November, there were over 500,000 casualties on the British side itself, over 1.2 million casualties on both sides, and a total of 9 miles were gained by the Allies. Into context, within the 9 years of the American Revolution, the British only lost 15,000 soldiers. So more in one day in Somme than the entire American Revolution. The Eastern Front hosted extremely bloody fighting as well. Although it was more mobile than the Western Front, they still used trench warfare as well. The German-Russian border would be the focal point of this fighting, with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians versus the Russians and Serbs. Although Russia was able to get the early upper hand on the Germans and the Austrians, because specifically the Austrians were poor fighters and the Germans were ill-prepared, the Russians were really no match for the German soldiers in general. In one 4-day battle, the Russians would lose 30,000 men killed in action, and this is just a small amount of Russians that would eventually die. Russia would burn through more soldiers in 2 years than the Germans would in 4. Thank you for tonight's lecture. Please summarize your notes, answering the essential question, and be prepared to discuss in class.